Hey guys, so as usual, I wanted to bring a tier list of the best hand traps and staples using data from Dueling Book using YGEoscope.com, as well as based on cards that were played in the topping deck list from the NAWCQ. Now, of course, we do have Duelist Nexus coming just in about 2 weeks, which will certainly shift the format quite a bit, and so I'll certainly try to make some comments regarding some of the cards in terms of how their impact would change. Now, before we continue, big thanks to my sponsors as usual. Links and discount codes for Yu-Gi-Oh! Supplies in the description below. Okay, so to start off the tier list for this month for the best hand traps and staples, we of course have Ash Blossom at number 1. Not a big surprise in terms of NAWCQ, the years before that. All of my top cut breakdowns in the last few months, we've seen Ash Blossom be number 1 ever since tier 0 tier limit format has ended. And moving into the next format with Duelist Nexus, I mean, as long as Branded and Labrynth are around, which they will, assuming that there's not going to be any kind of ban list and assuming there's not going to be even any hits to those decks, Ash is still going to be very good against certain strategies. Against most other strategies, obviously it can be sort of low impact, but in next format we're probably going into a more hand trap heavy format compared to right now, so Ash is probably going to still see a lot of play. And then speaking of hand traps, we do have talents because, this can definitely punish your opponent or yourself, I guess, if you hand trap your opponent. And then, if it was not that impactful and they talents, rip another card out of your hand, really hurts. Going second, though, obviously right now in the current format, it's very, very good. Just the way it is in this current game. But right now, or rather after Duelist Nexus, it's a little challenging because, for example, if with Mannadium being presumably a tier 1 deck and, them being able to put out that Calamity lock, like you're just not really going to be able to do this going second, so you kind of need more quick effect kind of cards, or rather maybe hand trap to prevent them from building a board in the first place. Next we have Feather Duster, which is a bit of an increase from last month, but at the same time really not surprising. Very good, no drawbacks. A lot of people are playing this card still. I mean, who knows, maybe it actually gets banned again. It's certainly up for debate now with, if people are saying, if Eradicator should go, then maybe Feather Duster should also go as well. And so anyways, regardless of which side you're on, next format, this is still going to be relevant, of course. I think it's going to be relevant in pretty much any format in this game of Yu-Gi-Oh! But next format, we do have Rescue Ace, which will also be possibly one of the top decks, and, they're a deck that can just like set 4 on will, and so Feather Duster or any kind of back row removal can be pretty useful. And then we have Dark Ruler no more. So right now, again, this is very good, right? Like you have things like, let's say, any kind of Sprite variant, as long as they're in the format, Dark Ruler is always going to be very good. Even against Kashtira, they're not really doing the zone 5 lock against you, at least not turn 1. So Kashtira, Dark Ruler can still be good because shutting off that Errata may just be enough for you to actually be able to play this game. But again, moving into that next format with Duelist Nexus, if they're Calamity locking you with at least Mannadium, you can't really do anything in those instances. We've seen these kind of formats before with VFD, for example, or even Numeron Zexal, both of which ended up getting banned, by the way. And in those formats you needed something like Droplet, for example, and even Droplet against VFD wasn't even that great because they could like chooch and pop and whatever. So anyways, Dark Ruler for right now, it's still good. Even next format, I think there's still applications, right? I mean, from the Infernoble boards that I'm seeing so far, I know it's very early and we're not officially into that format yet. I think Dark Ruler, it seemed like it would still work against them. They do have a couple spell trap negates, but they're through monsters, so Dark Ruler should be good. Against Mannadium, aside from the whole Calamity lock thing, they also happen to have a counter trap too, which of course means your Dark Ruler is not going to go through anyway, so just things to keep in mind. Next we have Imperm, and it's just similar to Ash, just like these two are just kind of like your given hand traps that will always see a lot of play, especially right now and maybe even next format where you're going to see a lot of talents and Thrustle most likely, and at least Imperm does not play into that, so it's really nice to have, and can also kind of shut down Floodgates too if that ever comes up. And then moving on to the B tier, we do have Cosmic Cyclone. Right now, I think this is really arguably A tier as well. I mean, it's really, really good, whether going first or second. It's just very, very useful in current game, right? I mean, you have like Labrynth, they have so much back row. Kashtira, Rebirth, Branded loss, get rid of that. I mean, against Rikka, getting rid of Concon is very, very big. And against just any kind of Floodgates. I guess moving to the next format, I mean, I know Rescue Ace is kind of like a back row heavy deck, but at the same time, I don't know if Cosmic's that great, just because they're more so like quick play spells or like traps. I mean, they do play, or rather they can play Gozen, so I guess that might come up. Certainly let me know in the comments, how useful this is going to be. Moving to the next format, I'm sure it will be. I mean, for the most part, assuming again there's no ban list, like you're still going to have a lot of the same decks that are going to be good decks in the next format, right? Like Kashtira, Branded, Labrynth, so Cosmic will most likely still be good in the format. Next we have Ghost Spell, which has certainly been seeing a lot of play the last couple of months, and I believe it was tied for second most played hand trap in the topping NAWCQ list, at least among those that were available. Can be really strong against certain decks, let's say like Branded or Labrynth. Definitely very useful against, you know, most other decks. It has like some kind of situation where you can use it, so certainly something to keep in mind. Again, moving next forward, next format, there's probably going to be a lot of hand traps played. Is this going to be one of them? I'm not too sure myself at this point, but certainly something to keep in mind. And then this is something that I kind of wanted to put a little separate note for, because while right now Droll and Lockboard may not be amazing, like it's still good. It's definitely been seeing increase in play actually the last, at least for the NAWCQ compared to like Euros, for example. And so even though right now it's good, I think next format it's going to be very, very good and quite frankly necessary. Again, with Mannadium, if they're putting out that Calamity Lock where you just can't play at all, you need to make sure that you can do something where you can prevent them from doing any of that in the first place. And Mannadium, since release, you know, it's been very susceptible to Droll in terms of their combo lines, so certainly something to keep in mind. I guess Purrely is another deck that I should comment on because they're also going to get more support. From what I heard though, unlike previously, I heard they can actually play through Droll pretty decently actually in the next format, so just things to keep in mind. But you know, if this was post-Dune, Droll would definitely be in the A tier right now. And then another one in terms of hand traps is Nibiru. Right now, again, pretty solid. Actually been seeing a decent increase in play compared to like a month ago. At the same time, you know, I guess next format, you know, usually when you're in kind of like hand trap heavy format, you're going to obviously see Nibiru, especially when you have like certain combo decks that are popular, like let's say Infernoble as well as Mannadium next format. And I think typically you kind of need like Nibiru plus another hand trap for it to be really useful, because a lot of times, you know, these decks can put up some kind of negate. From what I've seen in the early Infernoble combos, you know, post Dune, it looked like they could set up a monster negate through Gear Feed on the 5th summon, or let's say they have, you know, Aqua Dolphin, and if you, I guess Pat kind of mentioned this, if you were to like max out on the Gear Feeds, then you'd at least have a monster with 3000 attack that you can kind of snipe out that Nibiru from your opponent's hand as well. So it's something to consider. I'm sure we will see a good amount of play next format as well. So next we have Thrust, which of course, you know, similar to Talents, has definitely been seeing a lot of uptick in play lately. And you know, right now it's very, very good, right? In the current format, like let's say you're going second, most likely your opponent activates a monster fight, and you can get something like Dark Ruler, you can get something like Evenly or Lightning Storm, you know, all these powerful board breakers that are really, really good. But again, in the next format, you know, at least against Mannadium specifically, and I don't even know how often they're actually going to Calamity Lock. I mean, just assuming the worst, and let's say they do it often, you know, at that point, like what's the point of adding something like Dark Ruler? Or rather, you can't even activate anything really, because you won't even get a chance to activate Thrust because of Calamity. So you know, in that instance, maybe it's not as good. I'm sure it will still be good card though next format in terms of every other deck at least. And also, you know, whenever you're going first, again, hand trap heavy format, you know, you can still use this, set something as powerful as something like Eradicator or let's say D Barrier. So I'm sure it will still be useful next format. Speaking of Evenly Match, of course, this has actually kind of dipped a little bit in terms of tier score compared to like last month. Obviously, still a really strong card. You know, board wipe against something like Kashtira is really nice to have, and against, let's say, like Branded, it's also very good as long as they didn't sort of use their Sanctifier monster to like gimmick Pop It Lucky, or at least give you any kind of monster to stop you from evening. Against Labrynth, obviously backward heavy deck, really good. And you know, moving into the next format, you still have those same decks, but then you also have Rescue Ace, which can, of course, you know, set 4 like Evenly is pretty nice against that, and so definitely still applicable in the next format. Next we have Book of Moon, which is of course quite popular right now, especially among Kashtira as well as Flunder lists, and Flunder being one of the decks that's been seeing an uptick in play lately, with like the power of Shifter basically. And so, you know, Book of Moon is very good. Being able to shut down that Arise Heart is always nice, and also not to mention it can help protect you from, you know, dodging kind of targeting monster negation effects in particular, so certainly good to have. And then I also have just kind of Bisque Shields in general. I'm just using the picture Magmanut as an example. Usually you're seeing Magmanut plus Druid's Worm if you're seeing in decks anything outside of Dragon Link, which will play all of the Bisque Shields essentially. So this has definitely been seeing kind of like a decline in play the last little while. Obviously it's very good against certain decks, right? Branded, Labrynth, really good against Dragon Link as well. But then you have something like, let's say, Rikka, which Flunder, which you're obviously seeing an increase in play. Kashtira, pretty much dead against them as well. And then moving into the next format, you know, I guess against Mannadium it's still kind of like it comes up, but then you have something like, let's say, Infernoble or like Rescue Ace, they're all fires, so probably not going to come up, so probably will be on the little bit of decline, but who knows. And then moving on to the next tier, we have Dimension Shifter. Hopefully Konami will finally ban this card. Usually tier score wise, it's never that high because again, only certain decks can actually play this card, and because of, tier scores are based on largely representation, it's usually kind of like in the C tier, but if you can play it, this is definitely like A tier essentially, because most other strategies will fold under this, although we are in a bit of a unique situation where our best deck is in Kashtira, is also going to be something that plays Dimension Shifter and also banishes everything. Next we have Call By, which nowadays is actually side deck quite a bit compared to previously where this was sort of a given main deck card, but now like let's say when you're going first, you just really want extra ways to prevent any hand traps from stopping you. People definitely side this a lot, so it's certainly not as common as it used to be. Next we have Lightning Storm, which of course got semi-limited recently. Kind of a weird hit because it just kind of came out of nowhere, but at the same time I guess it's a little understandable. In terms of just generic going second cards, it's just been one of the best ones since this card has come out. I think it's always seen at least some form of play in any kind of topping deck list throughout since its release back in like January of I believe 2020, so I'm sure it will always be relevant. So next we have Eradicator Epidemic Virus, and hopefully this is another card that Konami will ban whenever that ban list comes out. And if you actually watch my recent ban list prediction survey result video, about half of the respondents actually predict this card would get banned. And so, obviously right now it's on the hot seat because you have decks like, let's say, Labrynth that can turbo out Eradicator sometimes. You also have just a lot of decks that are just playing Thrust and then they'll just set the Eradicator because having a Dark Monster with 2500 attack or higher is not too hard. And you also have just sort of a subjective factor with, let's say, a lot of the live stream events, like the bigger events, or rather the bigger high stake match like finals, you were seeing like Rikka just ripping out like 5 spells. So definitely something warranting of a ban. And right now in any future format, it's always going to be good, right? Like it can pretty much shut down a whole game mechanic, so definitely will be relevant if it stays around. Next we have Solemn Judgment, which from among the decks that top, it's usually not played that much nowadays, although on Dueling Book it always sees a good amount of play, and win percentage wise it's always pretty low with Solemn Judgment. I always found that kind of funny, but certainly something to consider. And then we have Book of Eclipse, which, when Kashtira was first kind of emerged as a tier 1 contender, everyone was playing Book of Eclipse, and ever since then, it's definitely saw a huge decline in play, and if they were playing a book, then it was just going to be Book of Moon, and at one point there was also Book of Lunar Eclipse, which sort of came around, but right now it's still decent, being able to shut down, like the whole Kashtira board, and, even going first, it can be pretty devastating, like just booking all your opponent's monsters. They do get to draw though, so you certainly have to keep in mind of that, but sometimes, maybe you have already a good enough board that you can sort of, or rather it's the only way to break through your opponent's board that it's still worth playing. And then we have D-Barrier, definitely saw a decline in play since, let's say, kind of like when Branded was sort of considered as like one of the better decks, and you have something like Labrynth which can turbo this out as well. Another card that I think, including myself, a lot of people would prefer to get banned, but I think it's kind of understandable if Konami doesn't again. It seems to always dodge it, and right now it's honestly not that great, and win percentage wise it wasn't that high either at 42% when this card was played. And then we have Effect Failure. So obviously Imperm is better, especially in a format where a lot of people are playing Talents or Thrust, but for certain decks that are drawing on like your opponent's turn, let's say something like Purrely is one example, being able to draw a card that can actually still be live when you control a card, unlike Imperm if you where you have to control no cards. Effect Failure can be useful in those instances. And then we have Super Poly. So this is another one that I decided to put a little note on because, and shout out to my friend Drew for pointing this out to me. Super Poly, I think next format is going to be pretty strong, especially against, like, let's say Mannadium, and in terms of that FTK kind of turn skip block with Calamity, you can actually prevent it by this card right here with Draco Acquisitive, because essentially you can kind of like get rid of like your opponent's Barone, as well as I believe it's Crimson Dragon that's going to pump out that Calamity, so you can kind of Super Poly those away. So if you are a deck that can play Super Poly and have the extra deck space, this is one of the considerations. And even against, let's say, something like Infernoble, they're like Fire Warriors, as long as you're playing like the generics like Garura, and then the other Super Poly targets are usually something like Starving Venom, Mud Dragon is a very important one, as well as something like Dragostapelia. Those are really good options, and I think next format this card will actually be very good for not just Branded but a lot of just other decks. And then moving on to the final tier, we have Dark Hole. Kind of saw an increase in play a little bit, especially when Vanquish Soul came out, like Rikka and Dark Hole. Those things were pretty funnily enough pretty good against that strategy because they need to have their monster on board. Like if you try to target it, then it's too bad. But you know, something like Dark Hole is actually pretty nice, especially against something like Kashtira as well. It can be pretty good. Where it can be not very good is when they have, let's say, they use Pot of Prosperity and they were able to just like attach that Infinitrack link to a Rise Art to protect it, and also of course Shangri-La is also protected as long as it has materials. So Dark Hole can be hit or miss, but against, you know, even like Spright boards, as long as you can bait out that spell trap negate, like it can also be quite devastating. Next we have Gamma's Heal, or just Kaijus in general. Interestingly enough, this has definitely saw a decline in play in the last month. It was at one point seeing a lot of play among a lot of topping lists, but nowadays I think they sort of moved away from having to at least feel the need to have Kaijus, especially when Purrely, let's say, you know, they weren't turboing out Nor as much as anymore with that kind of delicious limit, but you know, still certainly pretty good and something to consider for next format as well. And then finally, we do have Lava Golem. This one is not really seeing that much play in terms of topping deck lists, mainly because this is usually, if it's played, it's only really seen in like Labrynth, for example. Sometimes you see Branded played, but realistically, Branded does still need the normal summon. Like, yes, there are hands where you don't need to, but for the most part, you kind of need to. So really, this is a bit of a niche card, but it can board wipe really, really effectively. Alright, so that was it for the hand trap and staple tier list. Hopefully you found that helpful and interesting. Obviously we're going to move into a new format in a couple weeks, and so I'm really excited to see how all the hand trap and staple lineups going to change moving into the next format post Duelist Nexus. So big thanks to all of you for watching. A huge thanks to my patrons for their support as always, and well, take care guys.